Sorry, sir. You are all right now, sir.
To the outside world, Chai Ji-ho was a statue carved from obsidian and cold intention. In the heart of Seoul's Gangnam district, he sat behind a desk of polished ebony that reflected the neon pulse of the city below. A sprawling empire he ruled without ever hearing a single word of it. For Ji-ho, power wasn't a roar, it was a vibration. It was the subtle tremor of the floorboards when a nervous underling entered the room, the shift in air pressure when a door opened, and the frantic, rhythmic pulse of a man's carotid artery when he was lying. His morning routine was a testament to a life lived in a vacuum of absolute control. He dressed in silence, the silk of his tailored suit whispering against his skin, a sound he could only imagine. He adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes tracing the intricate tattoos that climbed his neck like dark ivy, remnants of a louder, more violent past that he had conquered through sheer observation. In the mirror, he saw a man who looked untouchable, but in his mind, he was a captain navigating by the stars in a world where the wind made no noise. Breakfast was served by staff who moved like ghosts. They had been trained for years. No sudden movements, no speaking unless their faces were directly in his line of sight, and never, ever touched the boss. His mother, Na-re-yoon, sat across from him, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes filled with a heavy, maternal sorrow that Ji-ho had long ago learned to ignore. She would sign to him occasionally, simple, sweeping gestures of love and caution, but mostly she just watched him. To her, he was a tragic miracle, a king who had been denied the music of the world. He treated his deafness as a sacred wound, something to be protected and hidden from the vultures circling the Torino-Yoon syndicate. Ji-ho stepped onto his balcony, looking out over the harbor. He watched the massive shipping containers being hoisted into the air, the heavy machinery moving with a grace that belied its power. He didn't need to hear the clanging of metal or the shouting of the dock workers to know that the shipment was late. He could see it in the way the foreman wiped his brow and the way the security detail shifted their weight. Silence was his greatest weapon. Because he could not hear, he had learned to see the truth that people hid behind their voices. He saw the stutter in a man's eyes before it ever reached his tongue. He saw the hesitation in a handshake. His empire was built on the fact that while everyone else was distracted by the noise of the world, Ji-ho was listening to the silence. It was a heavy, lonely weight, a crown made of lead, but it was the only life he knew. He was the master of a kingdom without a soundtrack, a man who ruled through the terrifying, focused energy of a world that was perfectly, deathly still. He believed this was his destiny, an eternal quiet that would only be broken by the grave. He had no way of knowing that the girl currently polishing the crystal in the hallway was about to bring the roar of the universe crashing into his ears. If you are already enjoying this story, hit the subscribe button, like, and comment where you're watching from. Sit tight as this video gets more intriguing. Now, let's dive into it. Mari Coles moved through the Torino-Yoon mansion, not as a servant, but as a ghost with eyes like a hawk. While the other household staff kept their heads bowed in a state of perpetual flight or fight, Mari maintained a quiet, clinical composure. She had been hired as a specialist maid, a role that required an eye for detail that bordered on the obsessive, exactly what a man like Choi Ji-ho demanded. To the rest of the world, she was just another uniform in a house of stone. But Mari had a background that none of them knew, a history of caring for those whose bodies held secrets. As she entered the mahogany-lined study to begin her morning rounds, she felt the heavy atmospheric pressure of Ji-ho's presence. He sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, a silhouette of absolute power against the rising Seoul skyline. He didn't turn. He didn't have to. Mari knew he could feel the vibration of the door closing, the subtle shift in the room's temperature. She began her work, dusting the crystal decanters with a rhythmic, predictable motion, ensuring her movements were within his peripheral vision. She watched him through the reflection in the glass. Jiho was a man of iron, but as Mari moved closer, she saw the minute cracks in the armor that the high-priced private physicians had dismissed as nervous tics. She noticed the way his jaw muscles bunched rhythmically, not in anger, but in response to a deep localized pressure. Most tellingly, she saw him tilt his head, a sharp, almost imperceptible jerk toward his right shoulder, as if he were trying to dislodge a weight that had been there for a lifetime. Mari froze, her cloth hovering over a silver tray. She watched his ear. To the doctors, Jiho was a medical mystery, a child born into silence. But Mari saw something different. She saw the skin around the tragus was slightly inflamed, a subtle discoloration, but spoke of a physical obstruction rather than a neurological failure. She remembered her training, the way a calcified blockage could mimic the symptoms of total deafness if left for decades. It was a simple thing, yet in this house of secrets, it felt like a monumental discovery. Nari-Yoon entered the room then, her presence as sharp as a blade. She hovered near her son, her hands fluttering in a series of anxious signs. Mari watched the mother's face. There was a desperate kind of vigilance there, a protective wall that seemed designed to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep the silence in. Nari looked at Mari, her eyes narrowing with a silent command to finish and leave. But Mari didn't move. She saw Jiho wince, a micro-expression of pain that lasted less than a second. It wasn't the wince of a man who couldn't hear. It was the wince of a man who was being crushed by a phantom weight inside his own skull. The doctors had called it phantom auditory syndrome, a byproduct of his condition. Mari knew better. She looked at the silver tweezers in her utility kit and then back at the powerful man who could have her removed with a single gesture. She saw a king in a cage of his own flesh, and for the first time, she decided she wasn't just there to clean the room, she was there to break the lock. The atmosphere in the study thickened, the air heavy with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the unsaid. Mari stood at the precipice of a choice that could either end her career or rewrite the life of the man before her. Protocol was the law of the Torino mansion. Guards were executed for less than a sudden movement. But Mari's eyes remained fixed on the slight, unnatural swelling of Jiho's ear. She didn't look at the guards at the door or the security cameras blinking in the corners. She looked at the man. With a slow, deliberate grace, Mari set her cleaning supplies down. She stepped into the circle of Jiho's personal space, a zone that even his highest-ranking lieutenants entered with bowed heads. Jiho didn't flinch, but his eyes tracked her through the reflection of the window, his body coiling like a spring. He was a predator, confused by the lack of fear in his prey. "Boss?" Mari murmured, knowing he couldn't hear the word, but hoping he could feel the calm intent behind it. She raised her hand. From the doorway, a sharp, ragged intake of breath cut through the stillness. Nari-Yoon had stepped further into the room, her face a mask of sudden, frantic terror. Her hands flew up, signing a panicked command for Mari to stop, to get away, to leave him alone. But it wasn't the protective anger of a mother that Mari saw in Nari's eyes. It was a desperate, shivering anxiety, as if Mari were holding a match to a fuse that Nari had spent 30 years trying to keep dry. Jiho felt the shift in the room's energy. He turned his head slowly, his chiseled jaw set, his cold gray eyes meeting Mari's steady gaze. In that moment, a silent communication passed between them. He saw the specialist's tools in her hand, the fine surgical-grade tweezers and a small light. He saw the professional distance in her expression, a look he had never seen on the faces of the terrified doctors his mother hired.
For the first time in his life, someone wasn't looking at him with pity or fear. They were looking at him as something that could be fixed. Nari lunged forward, her hand grasping Mari's arm with surprising strength. "No!" she signed frantically, her face pale. "He was born this way. The doctor said the nerves are dead. You will hurt him." Mari gently but firmly disengaged her arm. She didn't look at the mother. She kept her eyes on the son. She pointed to his ear and then to her tools, a silent question. The stakes were absolute. If she was wrong, she was a common servant who had assaulted a Mafia king. If she was right, the world Nari had built for her son was a lie. Jiho watched his mother's breakdown, then looked back at Mari. The pressure in his skull was a dull roar of its own, a physical weight he was tired of carrying. He saw Mari's hand tremble slightly, not from fear of him, but from the weight of the miracle she held. Slowly, deliberately, the most dangerous man in Seoul inclined his head, exposing his right ear to her light. He was giving her permission. He was offering her his silence, hoping she might finally find a way to break it. Nari fell back against a velvet chair, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a secret that was about to be heard.
The study became a vacuum, every person frozen in a tableau of unbearable tension. Mary took a breath to steady her hands, the silver light of her penlight cutting a sharp path into the depths of Jiho's ear. She saw it then, not a biological failure, but a dark, calcified mass that had fused into a literal wall between the man and the world. It was a pearl of silence, hardened by decades of neglect and, perhaps, intent. Jiho sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, his muscles taut like a bowstring about to snap. He felt the cold touch of the metal tool, a sensation so intimate and invasive it made his pulse thrum against his ribs. He was a man who had survived bullet wounds and betrayals without flinching, yet the proximity of this woman made his breath hitch. Across the room, Nari Yoon was a ghost of herself. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the velvet armrest, her lips moving in a silent, frantic prayer, or a confession. She watched with a terrifying intensity, her eyes darting between Mary's steady hands and her son's stoic face, waiting for the foundation of her world to crack. Mary's fingers moved with the precision of a clockmaker. She felt the resistance of the obstruction, a stubborn anchor of wax and mineral. With a slow, agonizingly careful rotation, she gained purchase. She felt the seal break. There was a faint, wet suction, a physical release of pressure that made Jiho's entire body shudder. Then she pulled. It happened in a heartbeat. The silence didn't just end, it died. To Jiho, it was as if a mountain had collapsed into the sea. The first sound wasn't music or a voice, it was the roar of his own existence. A sharp, rhythmic thudding filled his head, so loud he thought his heart might burst, the sound of his own blood rushing through newly opened channels.
Sorry, sir.
A ragged, high-pitched sound pierced through the cacophony. He flinched, his eyes wide and wild, searching for the source of the attack. It was Nari. His mother had let out a sharp, choked gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock that hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, seeing her mouth open, finally connecting the movement of her lips to the vibration in the air. But then, a softer sound anchored him. Mary was still leaning close, her chest mere inches from his shoulder. In the sudden, overwhelming new world, he heard it, the steady, calm thump-thump of her heart. It was a human rhythm, a grounding frequency amidst the terrifying noise. Jiho's hands flew to his ears, his face a mask of agony and wonder. He looked at Mary, his eyes searching hers, no longer a boss or a predator, but a man reborn into a world of thunder.
The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a hammer on an anvil. The hum of the air conditioner was a low, mechanical growl. He moved his own lips, tasting the air, and for the first time in 32 years, he let out a sound. It was a low, raspy groan of overwhelmed senses. He heard himself. The realization shattered what was left of his stoicism. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes as he realized the silence hadn't been a destiny. It had been a cage.
And as he looked at his mother's pale, terrified face, he realized the sound of her gasp wasn't just shock, it was the sound of a secret finally being heard. The transition from the velvet-lined silence of his estate to the raw, electric pulse of soul was not a victory, it was an assault. Within 48 hours of Marie's intervention, the world had become a jagged landscape of noise that Jiho's brain was ill-equipped to map. He stood on the edge of a bustling intersection in Myeongdong, flanked by his usual security detail, but for the first time he felt small. The city he once owned through sheer visual dominance was now a cacophony of screeching tires, the rhythmic thud-thud of a distant jackhammer, and the terrifying, overlapping chatter of thousands of voices. Every sound was a physical blow. The chirp of a crosswalk signal pierced his skull like a needle, and the roar of a passing bus felt like a wave of heat against his face. He watched his men, the same men who had served him for years, and realized he had been blind to their true nature. He heard the heavy, labored breathing of his lead bodyguard, a sign of hidden anxiety he had never sensed through sight alone. He heard the metallic snick of a lighter 3 cars away and the rustle of a shopping bag. It was a deluge of data, a chaotic stream of information that threatened to drown his logic. He ducked into a quiet alley, his breath hitching, his hands instinctively reaching to cover his ears before he caught himself. He was a king. He could not show weakness. As the ambient roar of the city softened into a hum, a new realization began to crystallize behind his aching eyes. Sound was not just a sensory experience, it was a currency. He recalled a meeting from only a week prior. He had sat across from a rival, watching the man's lips perfectly, convinced he understood the negotiation. But now, with his ears awakened, he understood what he had missed, the tone. He remembered the man's eyes had been steady, but he wondered now if his voice had trembled. He wondered if the loyal lieutenants standing behind him had shared whispered jokes or coded warnings in the frequencies he couldn't reach. Information had always been his greatest asset, but he had been working with half a ledger. He looked at his reflection in a rain-slicked window, the sharp suit, the tattoos, the chiseled jaw of a predator, and saw a man who was finally, dangerously complete. He didn't just see the city now, he heard its secrets. He heard the hesitation in the wind and the hidden rhythm of the streets. The pain in his head was the price of a new kind of sight. If sound was power, then Choi Jiho had just become the most powerful man in the country. But as he thought of his mother's pale, retreating face, he knew his first task wasn't to expand his empire. It was to listen to the shadows within his own walls and find out who had profited from keeping him in the dark. Jiho returned to the mansion not as a master, but as a silent recorder. He moved through the shadows of his own home with a predatory grace, his footsteps masked by the thick Persian rugs, his breathing shallow and controlled. The sensory overload of the city had crystallized into a razor-sharp focus. He was no longer drowning in sound, he was filtering it. He was looking for the frequencies of betrayal. He stood behind the heavy oak door of the secondary lounge, a room usually reserved for his security detail to rest. In the past, he would have walked in blindly, relying on his presence to command order. Now, he waited. He tilted his head, listening to the muffled vibrations through the wood. To his newly awakened ears, the door was no longer a barrier. It was a drum skin. "He's getting erratic," a voice rasped. Jiho recognized it as Min Kyu, his third in command, a man who had sat at his dinner table for a decade. "Did you see him in the study, letting that maid touch him? He's losing his edge. If he can't keep his own house in order, how is he going to handle the Japanese expansion?" A second voice, younger and edged with a nervous tremor, replied, "But the mother, Nadi Neem, said his condition was worsening. She said we need to prepare for a transition. She's already moving the offshore accounts." Jiho felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It wasn't just the guards, it was the foundation. He had ruled in silence, believing his disability was his greatest secret, but he realized now that his silence had been their greatest tool. They hadn't been loyal to a king, they had been loyal to a statue they could manipulate. They had spoken of his downfall inches from his face for years, mocking his calculated quiet while they carved up his empire. He heard the distinct clink of a glass being set down and the scratch of a chair against the floor. "The doctor says the new medication will keep him compliant," Min Kyu said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that Jiho could now hear with terrifying clarity. "Once the papers are signed, we won't need the silent king anymore. We'll have a puppet who doesn't even know he's being pulled." Jiho's hand tightened on the door handle, but he did not burst in. The old Jiho would have used violence. The new Jiho used information. He realized that every checkup he had endured, every bitter pill his mother had insisted he swallow, and every protective measure his guards had taken were threads in a web designed to keep him in a tomb of his own senses. The realization was a jagged pill to swallow. His deafness had been a tactical advantage for his enemies, a biological vault they had locked him in to steal his crown. He stepped away from the door, his heart hammering a rhythmic war drum against his ribs. He didn't need to see their faces to know they were dead men. He just needed to keep listening until he found the architect who had drafted the blueprints of his silence. As he vanished into the darkened hallway, the silent king was gone.
In his place was a man who heard every lie, every breath, and every heartbeat of the coup that was about to fail. The pursuit of the truth required a ghost, and in the sprawling, data-heavy labyrinth of Seoul, Mari Coles was the only ghost Jiho trusted. While his empire believed he was recovering from a migraine in his darkened suite, Jiho sat with Mari in the flickering light of a secure laptop, his newly sensitive ears picking up the frantic, mechanical whirring of the cooling fans and the rhythmic clicking of the keys. Every sound was a clue, every vibration a thread. The records from the SNU clinic were wiped 10 years ago, Mari whispered, her voice a low, soothing frequency in the quiet room. But a medical history isn't just a file, boss. It's a financial trail. Equipment, specialist consultations, and donations made in your name. Jiho watched her hands move. He was learning the sound of her competence, the decisive, crisp taps that signaled a breakthrough. He leaned in, hearing the rustle of his own silk sleeve. "Follow the money," he said, his voice still sounding foreign and gravelly to his own ears. "My mother never paid for anything in cash. She believed in the permanence of paper." Mari bypassed the encrypted firewalls of the Yoon family's private foundation. As the digital curtains parted, a web of systemic bribery emerged, laid out in cold, clinical rows of numbers. For over 2 decades, massive monthly retainers had been paid to a Dr. Kang, a man who had once been the rising star of otolaryngology, before retiring early to a secluded estate in Jeju. The payments weren't listed as medical fees. They were categorized as research grants for congenital sensory deprivation. "He wasn't treating you," Mari said, her eyes reflecting the blue light of the screen. "He was being paid to maintain a status quo. Look at the dates, Jiho." Jiho looked. The payments intensified every time he had undergone a major surgery as a teenager, surgeries that were supposed to repair his auditory nerves, but had in reality been the moments where the mechanical blockages were reinforced or replaced. The betrayal was architectural. He heard the sharp, sudden intake of Maury's breath as she scrolled further down, uncovering the source of the funds. The money hadn't come from his father's estate. It had been funneled through a shell company owned by his uncle, the very man who had been whispering in the lounge, but the authorizing signatures belonged to Nari Yoon. His mother hadn't just known. She had been the treasurer of his silence. The weight of the paper trail felt heavier than the silence ever had. Jiho realized that his entire identity, the Silent King, was a product manufactured by the two people who claimed to love him most. They had traded his hearing for his compliance, turning him into a weapon that couldn't hear the trigger being pulled.
He looked at Mari, the sound of her steady breathing the only honest thing in the room. "We don't go to the police," Jiho stated, his tone dropping to a predatory hum. "We don't go to the family. We find Dr. Kang. I want to hear the sound of his voice when he tries to explain why he buried me alive." The sun had not yet risen when Jiho entered his mother's private tea room, but the air was already thick with the scent of jasmine and the low, rhythmic hum of the floor heaters. Nari Yoon sat by the window, her back to the door, a silhouette of traditional grace that looked smaller, more fragile than he remembered. In the past, her silence had been a sanctuary. Now, every sound she made, the soft rustle of her silk hanbok, the clink of her porcelain cup, felt like a confession. Jiho didn't announce himself. He stood in the doorway, listening. He heard the uneven catch in her breath, a hitch that betrayed her awareness of his presence. He let the silence hang between them until it became a physical weight. Then he shattered it. "Why, Mother?" His voice was louder than he intended, echoing off the minimalist walls. Nari flinched, the porcelain cup clattering against its saucer. She turned slowly, her face a mask of tragedy and terror. She didn't sign. She looked at his ears, then at his eyes, realizing the wall she had built around him had finally crumbled. "Jihoya," she whispered, her voice a fragile reed in the wind. "You were never meant to hear that word." "I have heard many words lately," Jiho said, stepping into the light. The tattoos on his neck seemed to darken with his rising pulse. "I heard my guards planning my death. I heard my uncle's greed. And I heard the bank transfers signed in your name. You paid Dr. Kang to bury me in my own head. Tell me why, or I will let the silence return to this house permanently." Nari sank to her knees, her hands trembling as they moved in a frantic, habitual sign before she realized she could speak. "Your father," she choked out, the words spilling like blood from a wound. "He didn't die in an accident, Jiho. He was executed because he heard a secret he shouldn't have. The family, the elders, they wanted a successor they could control. They were going to kill you as a child because you were too sharp, too much like him." She reached out toward him, her eyes pleading. "The only way to save you was to make you harmless. I made a deal with your uncle. If you were deaf, you were no threat to their secrets. You would be the king, but a king who couldn't hear the whispers of the coup. I traded your ears for your life, Gio. I kept the world quiet so they wouldn't have a reason to quiet you forever." The revelation hit Jiho with the force of a physical blow. He heard the sincerity in her cracking voice, the high-pitched frequency of a mother's desperate, twisted love. She had clipped his wings to keep him in the cage where she thought he was safe. "You didn't save me," Jiho said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory vibration that made the tea in the cup ripple. "You just made sure I couldn't hear the sound of the knife as it was sharpened.
You let them steal 30 years of music and truth because you were afraid." He looked at her, not as a son, but as a sovereign who had just discovered the true extent of his kingdom's rot. The sound of her sobbing was the most painful thing he had heard since the silence broke, but he didn't move to comfort her. He turned toward the door, his mind already calculating the next move. He had heard the secret of his past. Now he needed to make sure his enemies heard the sound of his retribution. The grand hall of the Torino-Yun mansion was a cathedral of cold marble and colder hearts. Choi Ji-ho sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his expression a familiar mask of stoic indifference. To the men gathered there, the high-ranking captains, the ambitious lieutenants, and his uncle, who leaned back with a smug, predatory grin, Ji-ho was still the silent king, a figurehead whose disability was their greatest asset. They believed the room was theirs to control, a space where they could plot treason right in front of his unhearing eyes. Ji-ho didn't sign. He didn't move. He simply watched the atmospheric vibrations of the room, now bolstered by the high-definition input of his newly awakened ears. He heard the rhythmic tapping of his uncle's ring against the table, a sound like a countdown. He heard the nervous rustle of papers held by men who were ready to sign away his life. "The transition must be clean," his uncle whispered to the man beside him, his voice barely a breath, confident that the distance and the deafness made him invisible. "Once he signs the transfer for the Jeju ports, we move him to the sanitarium. If the mother interferes, handle her quietly." The lieutenant nodded, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "And the maid, she knows too much." "Dispose of her tonight," the uncle replied, his tone as casual as if he were ordering a drink. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ji-ho's fingers, laced together on the table, tightened almost imperceptibly. For 32 years, he had been a man who reacted. Today, he was a man who acted. He stood up slowly, the heavy mahogany chair screeching against the marble, a sound that made several men flinch, though they assumed he couldn't hear the violence of the noise. He looked directly at his uncle, his gray eyes piercing and lethal. In the past, he would have waited for a translator. Instead, he reached out and grabbed the transfer documents, tearing them in half with a crisp, definitive sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room.
"The Jeju ports aren't for sale," Ji-ho said. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of total, paralyzing shock. His voice was raspy, the cadence slightly off, but the authority behind it was undeniable. His uncle's face drained of color, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the man he thought he had neutralized. "And Mari Coles," Ji-ho continued, his voice growing stronger, a predatory vibration that seemed to shake the very walls, "is under my personal protection. Anyone who looks at her with a shadow in their mind will find out exactly what I do to ghosts." He leaned over the table, his face inches from his uncle's. "I heard every word, Uncle. I heard the greed in your breath. I heard the cowardice in your heartbeat. You thought my silence was a weakness, but it was a cage you built for yourself. Now, I am the one with the keys." He signaled to the doors, which burst open as the few guards truly loyal to the crown, men Mari had helped him vet through their whispers, entered the room. The transition wasn't the one his uncle had planned. As the conspirators were led away in a symphony of panicked pleas and dragging feet, Ji-ho remained at the head of the table. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the house. He heard the wind in the eaves, the distant hum of the city, and the steady, brave footsteps of Mari approaching the hall. The silent king was dead. Long live the king who hears everything. The final scene of Choi Ji-ho's journey is one of intimate resolution and the quiet power of a shared future. After the storm of the Grand Hall had settled, after his uncle was escorted into the cold, permanent silence of the underworld's highest security prison, and the traitors were purged from his ranks, the mansion fell into a state of grace it had never known. The fortress of secrets had finally become a home. Ji-ho stood once more on the balcony of his study, the same place where he had spent 32 years watching a silent world. But now he wasn't just watching. He closed his eyes and leaned into the evening. He heard the distant melodic chime of a street performer's flute in Myeongdong, the rhythmic hum of the evening traffic, and the soft, comforting rustle of the leaves in the courtyard below. Each sound was a gift, a layer of reality he was no longer denied. A soft footfall echoed against the marble behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Mari. He had memorized the cadence of her walk, steady, purposeful, and honest.
"The mother has been moved to the villa in Jeju," Marie said, her voice now the most beautiful frequency in his world. "She is safe, Ji-ho, and she is quiet." Ji-ho turned to face her. The hard, jagged edges of the Mafia boss had softened into something more human, though no less formidable. He looked at the woman who had dared to touch a king, and in doing so, had freed him. "I spent my whole life thinking silence was my shield," Ji-ho said, his voice now strong and resonant. "I thought if I couldn't hear the world, it couldn't hurt me. But you showed me that the most dangerous things are the things we refuse to listen to." He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. In the past, this proximity would have been a threat. Now it was a sanctuary. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, before he gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, a mirror of the intimate gesture she had once used to save him. "I need a partner, Marie, not a maid and not a ghost. I need someone who can help me listen to the truth of this city, someone I can trust when the world gets too loud." Marie looked up at him, her expression a mix of solemnity and a burgeoning, quiet hope. She didn't need to answer with words. The steady, rhythmic beat of her heart, which Ji-ho could hear as clearly as a drum, told him everything he needed to know. As the lights of Seoul flickered on, painting the horizon in 1,000 different colors, Choi Ji-ho finally understood the true meaning of his reign. He was no longer the silent king. He was a man who had reclaimed his senses, and with them, his soul. He took Marie's hand, and together they stepped back into the room. The story of the Mafia boss born into silence ended there, not with a bang or a shout, but the simple, beautiful sound of two people walking together into a world that was finally, perfectly audible.